The restaurant was louder than I expected. Extended family filled the long table. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in months. My parents sat at the center, smiling like they'd been waiting for this moment. The dinner was supposed to celebrate a community project that had taken me 8 months to complete. I'd coordinated vendors, filed permits, managed budgets. My name was on every document. But when my father stood to speak, he gestured to my mother and said, "We're so proud of what we've accomplished together." He described the work in detail. He thanked the family for their support. He never said my name. My mother nodded along, accepting congratulations from relatives who didn't know any better. I sat 3 seats down, fork in hand, watching it happen in real time. No one looked at me. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should know better, maybe you'll understand why I stayed quiet and kept listening. I wasn't sure yet what to do, but I knew I couldn't let it sit. My sister leaned over and whispered, "They worked so hard on this." I didn't correct her. I didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone. The appetizers came. People asked questions about timelines, challenges, budgets. My father answered all of them. He knew the answers because I'd briefed him 2 days earlier. He'd asked for a summary so he could stay informed. I thought he wanted to support me. I didn't realize he was rehearsing. My mother added small details, things I'd told her over the phone. They sounded confident. They sounded like people who had earned the recognition. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face neutral. I'd learned a long time ago that reacting in public only made things worse. So I sat there, cutting my food into smaller pieces, and let the conversation continue without me. This wasn't new. It had been happening for years. Every time I took on something significant, the credit quietly shifted. In family conversations, my work became we or the family effort. If I tried to clarify, I was told I was being selfish. "We all contribute," my mother would say. "Why does it matter who gets mentioned?" But it did matter. I'd handled estate paperwork after my grandmother passed. My name wasn't brought up when relatives thanked my parents for managing everything. I'd organized my brother's wedding logistics. At the reception, my father gave a speech about how much he and my mother had done. I was introduced as someone who helped out. I stopped keeping track after a while. It was easier to stay quiet than to fight for something that should have been automatic. What made it worse was how much they expected. I was always the one they called when something needed to be done properly. Documents, planning, anything that required follow-through. My brother tried once and gave up halfway. My sister was too busy with her own life, so it fell to me, and I did it. I didn't want to let people down, but somewhere along the way, doing good work became the same as being invisible. My contributions were assumed. My presence was expected. My name was optional. I started to notice how often I was the one working late while everyone else made plans. How often I was thanked privately and ignored publicly. How often I was told I was so good at this, right before being handed another task no one else wanted to do. I used to think it would change, that one day someone would acknowledge what I'd actually done, that my parents would introduce me properly, that my siblings would back me up, that I wouldn't have to be the one to speak up for myself. But it never happened. The pattern was too comfortable for everyone else. I was dependable. I was capable. I didn't complain, so why would anything need to change? I became the person who made things work behind the scenes. The person who was credited as part of the collective but never named individually. And for a long time, I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't doing it for recognition. But sitting at that table, listening to my father describe my work as his own, I realized I'd been lying to myself. 3 weeks before the dinner, I'd done something I hadn't told anyone about. I'd submitted the full project documentation to the county records office. It wasn't required, but I wanted a verified, time-stamped copy on file. My name was listed as the primary coordinator and sole signatory. Every permit, every vendor contract, every financial record had my name on it. I didn't do it because I was planning anything. I did it because I wanted proof that I had done this work. Proof that existed outside of my family's version of events. I didn't know if I'd ever need it, but I wanted it to exist somewhere that couldn't be rewritten or reinterpreted. Somewhere that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding or a shared effort. I kept the receipt in my email. I didn't tell anyone. I just wanted the truth to be documented. At the time, I wasn't sure why it mattered so much. Maybe I knew on some level that this moment would come. That I'd be sitting somewhere, watching my work get reassigned, and I'd need to know I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't overreacting, that the records would back me up if I ever needed them to. I didn't think about it like leverage. I just thought about it like insurance, a way to protect the truth if the truth ever got buried. And now, sitting at this dinner, I was glad I'd done it. Because everything my father was saying sounded so convincing. If I didn't have proof, I might have started to doubt myself. I might have wondered if I'd overstated my role. But I knew better. I had the documents, and I had the record. The main course arrived. My father was still talking. A cousin asked how long the project had taken. He said 6 months. It had been 8. He said the hardest part was coordinating with local officials. I'd done all of that. He said my mother had handled the budget. I'd built the budget from scratch. Every detail he shared was technically true, but none of it included me. And no one questioned it. Why would they? He sounded authoritative. He had the answers. And I was just sitting there, silent, which made it look like I had nothing to add. I thought about saying something, but I'd learned that correcting people in public made me look difficult. It made me look like I was trying to take credit. So I stayed quiet, and I hated that I stayed quiet. I glanced around the table. My siblings were nodding along. My relatives looked impressed. A family friend asked if they'd consider doing another project. My mother smiled and said they'd think about it. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, just clarity. This was never going to stop. As long as I kept working behind the scenes, as long as I kept accepting private thank yous and public invisibility, this would keep happening. They didn't see it as wrong. They saw it as normal. I was part of the family. Family efforts didn't need individual credit, except I wasn't the one being erased when things went wrong, only when things went right. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. I wasn't going to argue. Not here, not now, but I wasn't going to forget either. I noticed one person at the table who hadn't said much, an older colleague of my father's, someone I'd worked with briefly during the project. He'd signed off on some of the permits. He knew my name was on the paperwork. I wondered if he'd noticed the gap between what was being said and what had actually happened. He was quiet, polite, listening. I didn't expect him to say anything. People rarely did. But I saw him glance at me once, just briefly, and I couldn't tell if it was acknowledgement or curiosity. I looked away. I didn't want to read into it. I didn't want to hope that someone else would speak up for me. I'd waited for that before. It never came. So I focused on my plate and let the conversation continue. After that dinner, I started pulling back. Not dramatically, just quietly. When my mother called and asked me to look into something, I said I was busy. When my father forwarded me a planning document and asked for input, I replied briefly and didn't offer extra details. I stopped volunteering. I stopped anticipating what they'd need. I stopped being the person who made everything easier. At first, no one noticed. They were used to me saying yes. When I didn't, they just moved on to someone else or let the task sit. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't explain. I just started protecting my time and my energy. It felt strange at first, like I was doing something wrong. But I wasn't. I was just stopping doing something I'd never been asked to do in the first place. A few weeks passed. My brother called and asked if I could help with some financial paperwork. I told him I couldn't. He sounded surprised. He said it wouldn't take long. I said I still couldn't. He didn't push. My mother texted and asked if I'd reviewed a contract she'd sent. I hadn't. I told her I didn't have time. She sent a follow-up asking when I'd be free. I didn't reply right away. I wasn't being petty. I was just being honest. I didn't have the capacity to keep doing unpaid work that no one would remember I did. And I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The requests slowed down. I don't think they connected it to the dinner. I think they just assumed I was going through something, which, in a way, I was. I didn't talk to anyone about what I was feeling. I didn't vent to friends or post anything online. I just carried it quietly and focused on my own work, my actual work, the kind that had my name on it from the start, the kind that didn't require me to fight for acknowledgement. It felt good to put energy into something that couldn't be taken from me. I started sleeping better. I stopped checking my phone as often. I stopped feeling guilty for not being available. And slowly, I started to realize that the discomfort I'd been feeling wasn't about being unappreciated. It was about being erased, and I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I didn't need anyone's permission to stop participating. I just stopped. A month later, my father hosted another family gathering. smaller this time. A few relatives, the same colleague from before. The project came up again in conversation. My father started to explain it the same way he had at the restaurant, but this time the colleague interrupted gently. He said, "I thought this was coordinated by your daughter. Her name's on all the county records." The table went quiet. My father paused. He said, "Well, we all contributed." The colleague nodded slowly. "Sure. But the filings list her as the primary contact. I remember because I had to confirm it with the office." He wasn't being confrontational. He was just stating a fact, but the fact was enough. My mother looked at me. My father looked at the colleague. No one knew what to say. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't jump in to smooth things over or minimize what had just been said. I just sat there and let the truth sit with everyone else. My father cleared his throat and changed the subject. The colleague didn't press, but the shift had happened. The story they'd been telling didn't hold up under the smallest bit of scrutiny, and now everyone at the table knew it. My sister looked uncomfortable. My brother stared at his drink. My mother folded her napkin. I stayed calm. I didn't need to say anything. The records had spoken for me. The truth had been verified by someone who had no reason to lie. And that was enough. I wasn't angry. I wasn't smug. I was just present. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. After that, things were different. Not openly. No one apologized. No one sat me down and acknowledged what had happened. But the requests stopped. The assumptions stopped. When my father talked about the project after that, he either didn't bring it up or mentioned it vaguely without taking credit. My mother stopped forwarding me tasks. My siblings stopped assuming I'd handle things. It wasn't a conversation. It was just a quiet recalibration. They'd learned that I had documentation. That I wasn't going to stay silent forever. That I had boundaries, even if I hadn't stated them out loud yet. I didn't need a big confrontation. I just needed the facts to be undeniable. And now they were. I felt lighter, not victorious, just lighter. Like I'd put something heavy down and didn't have to pick it up again. A few weeks after that gathering, my mother called. She asked if I'd be willing to help with another family project. I said no. She asked why. I said, because I won't work on anything where my role isn't acknowledged up front. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not fair." I said, "It's fair to me." She didn't argue. She just said she'd figure it out another way. I told her that sounded like a good plan. The call ended. I didn't feel bad. I didn't feel guilty. I'd stated a boundary and I'd meant it. I wasn't asking for an apology. I wasn't asking for credit I'd already earned. I was just saying I wouldn't participate in something that erased me. That was reasonable. That was necessary. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. I didn't hear from them much after that. Not in a hostile way, just in a distant way. Holiday texts, brief check-ins, nothing that required much from me. I didn't chase connection. I didn't try to repair anything. I just let the distance be what it was. I focused on my own life, my own work, my own sense of what I was worth. And I stopped measuring my value by whether or not my family recognized it. That wasn't my job anymore. My job was to protect my energy and my integrity. To make sure I wasn't giving more than I could afford to lose. To make sure I wasn't letting other people write the story of my life. I was the one who knew what I'd done. I was the one who had the proof, and I was the one who got to decide what came next. Months passed. I built a routine that didn't include waiting for acknowledgement. I took on projects I cared about. I spent time with people who saw me clearly. I stopped going to family events that felt performative. I wasn't cutting anyone off. I was just choosing where I showed up. And I only showed up where I felt like I could be honest. The anger faded. The hurt faded. What was left was just clarity. I knew what had happened. I knew what I'd tolerated. And I knew I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. That didn't require a dramatic exit. It just required consistency. I kept my boundaries. I kept my distance. And I kept moving forward. My life didn't look the way I thought it would, but it felt more mine than it ever had before. I don't think about that dinner as often anymore. When I do, I don't feel small. I feel clear. I know what I'm capable of. I know what I've built. And I know I don't need anyone else to verify it for me. The records exist. The truth exists. And I exist whole and intact outside of anyone else's version of events. I'm not waiting for things to change. I'm not hopping for apologies. I'm just living my life on terms that respect who I am and what I've done. That's enough. Thanks for staying with me through this. If this resonated with you, I'd love for you to like or subscribe. And I'm curious, have you ever had to set a boundary with family, even when it felt uncomfortable? Let me know.